On the 14th of June 1944, on a narrow road south of Carentan in Normandy, German infantry moving west encountered an American vehicle they could not immediately classify. It was not a tank, and it was not standard artillery. The gun was too large for the truck carrying it, and the truck was moving under its own power rather than waiting behind a gun line. The barrel extended far beyond the cab, and its recoil mechanism had been reinforced with crude steel bracing. The weapon was a naval cannon, originally designed for use at sea, now mounted on a wheeled chassis intended for cargo. The shell weighed roughly 45 kilograms, and when it fired, the blast altered the ground around it rather than the target alone, collapsing nearby hedgerows and damaging buildings that were not being directly aimed at. German soldiers observing this did not react with panic. Their first response was procedural. They tried to place the weapon into a known category because German training relied on recognition and classification. Artillery had rules, tanks had limits. Anti-tank guns followed patterns of deployment. This object followed none of those expectations. It advanced on roads, halted briefly, fired once or twice, and then relocated before counterfire could be organized. The firing interval, measured at roughly 10 minutes between displacements, meant that sound ranging and visual spotting produced inconsistent results. The gun was gone before its position could be fixed with certainty. At this stage of the campaign, German infantry in Normandy were already operating under strained assumptions. Since June 6th, units had been forced into fragmented defence across hedgerows, villages, and narrow causeways. Supply lines were disrupted, air cover was limited, and communication between formations was uneven. Under those conditions, weapons that did not behave according to established doctrine created a disproportionate effect. The truck-mounted naval gun did not need to be numerous. One such vehicle operating along a sector could be mistaken for several batteries firing from different locations because the displacement pattern violated expectations about how heavy guns were supposed to behave on land. German soldiers referred to the weapon informally, not as a technical designation, but as a descriptive term. It was called a devil truck, not because of superstition, but because it behaved in a way that suggested intent rather than routine. Standard artillery followed schedules. This weapon appeared irregularly. Standard guns fired from behind the line. This gun fired from roads the infantry themselves had used earlier that day. The psychological effect came not from its destructive power alone, but from its refusal to conform to the logic German soldiers relied upon to anticipate danger. The American forces operating these weapons did not advertise them. They were improvised solutions, created to bring heavy naval firepower inland, where beachhead artillery was insufficient. The guns had been removed from damaged or surplus naval mounts and adapted for ground use because the existing infrastructure could support their ammunition supply. For German observers, however, the origin of the weapon was less important than its presence. A naval gun belonged offshore. Its appearance on a country road signalled that previous boundaries between land and sea warfare were no longer reliable. Reports from German units in the Carentan sector noted the unusual acoustic signature of the weapon. The firing sound was deeper and longer than standard field artillery, with a pressure wave that arrived after the initial report. This delayed concussion created confusion among troops attempting to judge distance and direction. Soldiers accustomed to estimating artillery range by sound found their instincts unreliable. A shell that seemed distant could land nearby. A firing position that seemed close might already have been abandoned. The effect on movement was immediate. Patrols hesitated to use roads previously considered safe. Supply columns delayed movement until darkness, even though American air power already made night travel risky. Defensive positions were reinforced in areas that had not previously been targeted, simply because the gun's mobility suggested it might appear there next. None of these reactions were ordered from higher command. They emerged at platoon and company level, as small adjustments made by men attempting to restore predictability to their surroundings. The weapon did not change the tactical situation by itself. It did not decide battles, capture ground, or break formations. What it altered was the sense of proportion. German soldiers understood artillery. They understood tanks. They did not understand why a naval gun was following infantry advances inland, firing from roads, and withdrawing before engagement could occur. That lack of understanding forced them to reconsider assumptions they had relied on since the beginning of the war. At the time, this adaptation by American forces did not appear important. It would not remain so. By late June 1944, the German units facing American forces in Normandy had begun to integrate the appearance of the truck-mounted naval guns into their internal explanations of the battlefield. These explanations did not come from headquarters circulars or formal intelligence summaries. They emerged from conversations between squads, from after-action remarks, and from fragments of observation shared during lulls in shelling. The weapon was no longer entirely unfamiliar, but it was still poorly understood, and this partial understanding proved more dangerous than ignorance. German soldiers initially assumed the gun's presence indicated desperation. Naval cannons belonged to ships, and their appearance on land suggested to many that the Americans were improvising under pressure. This interpretation fit older assumptions about Allied reliance on material excess rather than doctrinal precision. The belief was that such weapons were inefficient, difficult to supply, and unsuited to sustained land combat. From this perspective, the gun was not a sign of strength but of temporary adaptation, something impressive but ultimately unsustainable. This belief shaped early reactions. Infantry commanders did not prioritize the destruction of these vehicles. Anti-tank assets were held back for armored threats. Artillery observers focused on known battery positions rather than searching roads and villages for mobile guns. When the weapon appeared, units endured the shelling and resumed movement once it withdrew. The damage was recorded, but the system itself was not challenged. The gun was treated as an anomaly, not as a component of American fire doctrine. The assumption rested on a misunderstanding of scale. The naval gun mounted on a truck did not need to be numerous to be effective. Its value lay in timing and placement. When it fired, it did so during moments of transition, while German units were relocating, resupplying, or consolidating. A shell landing during such moments disrupted coordination rather than fortifications. A single round could delay movement for an hour, not because of casualties, but because officers had to re-establish control and verify that the firing had ceased. German reports from sectors west of St. Lo noted that the gun often fired fewer than 5 rounds per appearance. This low rate reinforced the belief that ammunition supply was limited. In reality, the constraint was not supply, but intent. The Americans were using the weapon to puncture routines rather than to saturate positions. Each firing episode was brief, deliberate, and followed by immediate relocation. The gun was not part of a bombardment. It was part of an interruption. The psychological effect became clearer as weeks passed. Soldiers learned that silence did not indicate safety. The absence of firing no longer meant the enemy was inactive. Roads that had been shelled once were avoided long after the gun had moved on. The weapon's mobility created a lingering uncertainty that outlasted its physical presence. This was not how German soldiers were trained to think about heavy artillery, which was supposed to be fixed, predictable, and tied to terrain. By early July, German units began adjusting informally. Movement schedules were altered. Marches were broken into shorter segments. Units paused longer under cover before crossing exposed roads. None of these changes were dramatic. Each adjustment seemed reasonable on its own. Together, they slowed operations and increased fatigue. The battlefield did not become more violent, but it became more cautious. Attempts were made to counter the weapon directly. Forward observers were instructed to watch for trucks with reinforced suspensions and unusual barrel lengths. However, the visual identification was difficult. The gun resembled cargo vehicles at a distance, and American camouflage obscured distinguishing features. By the time a vehicle was confirmed as a threat, it had usually fired and withdrawn. Counter-battery fire arrived late or struck empty ground. German soldiers also misjudged the intent behind the weapon's use. Many believed it was deployed primarily to destroy fortified positions. In practice, it was more often used against crossroads, assembly areas, and supply routes. The damage inflicted was not always visible, but its effect on tempo was measurable. A unit delayed by 30 minutes could miss a coordination window. A convoy rerouted to avoid a shelled road might arrive after darkness, compounding existing risks from air attack. The belief that the weapon was inefficient persisted longer than it should have. It fit existing narratives and required no revision of doctrine. Accepting that the Americans had found a method to integrate naval firepower into land maneuver challenged deeper assumptions about the separation of combat domains. That challenge was resisted at the lowest levels, where soldiers relied on familiar explanations to maintain confidence. As July progressed, the gun's presence became normalized, but not neutralized. It was spoken of with irritation rather than alarm. Soldiers complained about its timing and unpredictability, but they no longer expressed surprise. This familiarity masked the cumulative effect the weapon was having on behavior. The gun did not dominate conversations, but it quietly shaped decisions, influencing where men moved and how they rested. The men believed they understood what they were facing. They did not. By mid-July 1944, the fighting in Normandy had settled into a pattern defined less by movement than by friction. German units were no longer attempting broad counterattacks. Instead, they focused on holding villages, road junctions, and narrow belts of terrain that could slow the American advance. It was within this environment that the truck-mounted naval guns began to exert a deeper influence, not through increased use, but through the gradual erosion of assumptions that German soldiers relied upon to make sense of the battlefield. One of the most important assumptions concerned scale. German doctrine was built on the idea that weapons revealed their importance through concentration. Heavy artillery appeared in batteries, tanks operated in groups, air attacks arrived in waves. The naval gun on a truck violated this logic. It appeared alone or in pairs, fired briefly, and disappeared. Its isolation suggested insignificance, yet its effects contradicted that conclusion. A single shell collapsing a stone wall or destroying a command post created consequences disproportionate to the effort involved. German soldiers struggled to reconcile this contradiction. If the weapon was important, it should be visible more often. If it was unimportant, it should not influence behavior. Instead, it occupied an ambiguous position. It did not dominate the soundscape like sustained artillery fire, yet it could not be ignored. This ambiguity forced soldiers to hold two conflicting ideas at once, that the weapon was rare and that it might appear anywhere. Time became a critical factor. Observations suggested that the gun was often active during periods of transition, particularly during reliefs between units or shifts in defensive posture. These moments were already vulnerable, involving movement, exposed personnel, and disrupted communication. The arrival of heavy fire during such intervals magnified its impact. A shell landing during a relief could delay the process by hours, forcing units to repeat coordination steps and re-establish command relationships. German attempts to impose structure on this threat focused on timing. Units tried to identify patterns in firing schedules, hoping to predict when the gun might appear. This effort failed because there was no fixed schedule. The Americans were using the weapon opportunistically, not cyclically. The absence of a pattern undermined confidence in prediction itself. Soldiers accustomed to adjusting behavior based on observed routines found themselves without reliable reference points. Distance estimation also became unreliable. The naval gun's acoustic profile differed from field artillery. Its report carried differently, and its concussion arrived with a delay that confused directional judgment. German soldiers reported difficulty determining whether the gun was firing from nearby roads or from positions several kilometers away. A misjudgment of even 1 kilometer altered decisions about whether to advance, hold, or withdraw. These errors accumulated over time, slowing reaction speed and increasing hesitation. The weapon also blurred distinctions between front and rear areas. Roads previously considered relatively secure, used for supply and communication, became potential firing positions. This forced German units to treat rear areas with increased caution. Guards were posted where none had been needed before. Vehicles moved with greater spacing. Messages were delayed as couriers waited for perceived safe windows. None of these changes were dramatic, but each added friction to an already strained system. Importantly, the gun did not need to fire frequently to sustain this effect. In some sectors, it appeared only once every several days. The interval between appearances did not restore confidence. Instead, it extended uncertainty. Soldiers could not dismiss the threat as resolved because its absence did not indicate removal. The gun existed somewhere beyond immediate observation, and that knowledge altered behavior continuously. German soldiers attempted to communicate their concerns upward, but the reports lacked clarity. Descriptions varied. Some emphasized the gun's size, others focused on its mobility. Without a standardized classification, the weapon resisted formal integration into threat assessments. Higher command, dealing with larger operational pressures, treated these reports as secondary. The weapon remained a local problem, managed at the level of experience rather than policy. This gap between experience and doctrine created tension. Soldiers felt something had changed, but they lacked the language to articulate it in terms that would prompt institutional response. As a result, adaptation occurred informally. Men adjusted routes, altered routines, and delayed actions based on intuition rather than orders. This reliance on individual judgment increased variation in behavior across units, further complicating coordination. The cumulative effect was not immediately visible. There was no single engagement where the gun's presence could be identified as decisive. Instead, its influence appeared in the margins: delayed movements, cautious advances, and increased fatigue. These outcomes were difficult to attribute to a single cause, which allowed the underlying mechanism to remain unexamined. What was known was limited. What was unknown was already shaping decisions. By August 1944, the German defensive system in Normandy had deteriorated beyond recovery. This collapse did not occur in a single moment, nor was it caused by any one weapon. It unfolded through accumulated pressure, attrition, and the steady erosion of confidence in familiar structures. Within this broader process, the truck-mounted naval guns occupied a small but revealing place, one that German soldiers understood only after the conditions that made that understanding useful had already passed. As American forces expanded beyond the hedgerow country and began breaking out of Normandy, the improvised naval guns appeared less frequently. Their role diminished as standard artillery and armoured formations caught up with the advance. To many German soldiers, this disappearance confirmed earlier assumptions that the weapon had been temporary, a stopgap measure relevant only to the confined terrain near the beaches. At the tactical level, attention shifted to more immediate threats, including armour, air attack, and the growing speed of American movement. Yet the behavioural changes induced by the weapon did not immediately reverse. Units continued to avoid roads that had once been shelled. Movement schedules retained their cautious spacing. Guards remained posted in rear areas longer than doctrine required. These habits persisted because they had become embedded responses rather than conscious decisions. The gun was no longer present, but its influence remained in the form of altered routines. Only later did some German soldiers begin to reassess what they had experienced. In retrospect, the naval gun on a truck was not significant because of its firepower alone. Its importance lay in how it disrupted expectations. It demonstrated that the Americans were willing and able to repurpose weapons across domains, using naval assets in land combat without waiting for doctrinal approval. This flexibility contrasted sharply with German reliance on established categories and procedures, which required time and formal recognition before adaptation could occur. The delayed recognition of this difference mattered. By the time German units acknowledged that the weapon represented a broader approach rather than an isolated improvisation, the campaign had moved beyond the stage where local adjustments could alter outcomes. The gun had already served its function by creating uncertainty during a critical period of consolidation and advance. Its contribution was subtle, measured not in territory gained but in decisions delayed and confidence eroded. German after-action reports compiled later in the war mentioned the weapon sparingly. When it appeared, it was often described as an unusual detail rather than a focal point. This treatment reflected the difficulty of assigning importance to effects that were indirect and cumulative. The gun did not destroy divisions or force retreats. It influenced timing, perception, and behaviour, elements that were harder to quantify and easier to overlook. For the soldiers who encountered it directly, memory was more specific. They remembered the sound, the brief appearance, the way it forced them to wait or reroute. They remembered the frustration of being unable to respond effectively. These recollections were not dramatic. They were matter of fact, framed as inconveniences rather than crises. Yet taken together, they revealed a pattern of disruption that aligned with the broader American approach in Normandy. Applying pressure at points of transition rather than attempting decisive blows everywhere at once. The truck-mounted naval gun was not standardized after Normandy. It did not become a permanent feature of American land warfare. Its usefulness was tied to a specific context where heavy firepower was needed quickly and infrastructure limitations demanded improvisation. Once those conditions changed, the weapon receded into obscurity. This disappearance further contributed to its marginal status in historical narratives. For German soldiers, the lesson emerged too late to be operationally useful. The realization that familiar boundaries between weapon categories could be ignored without penalty challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about warfare. Such assumptions had provided structure and predictability in earlier campaigns. In Normandy, they proved brittle. The naval gun on a truck was one of several signals that the environment had changed and that previous models no longer applied cleanly. The final phase of the campaign offered little opportunity for reflection. Retreat, encirclement, and loss of cohesion dominated experience. In that context, earlier encounters with unconventional weapons blended into a general sense of instability. Only with distance did some veterans identify those moments as early indicators of a shift in how the enemy operated. By the time German forces withdrew from Normandy in late August 1944, after roughly 11 weeks of continuous fighting, the truck-mounted naval guns had already served their purpose. They had not altered the course of the campaign alone, but they had contributed to a pattern of uncertainty that accumulated faster than it could be resolved. This change was subtle at first, but it altered behavior long before results were visible.